We're continuing our discussion of storytelling. Storytelling and reimagining responsibility as leadership. And I can't think of a better author to discuss this with than Professor Chris Marquis. We had hoped on some of the materials to have a second author, Eve Driver. She's not able to join us, but her book is terrific, and I hope you'll take a look, What We Can't Burn. It is a really thoughtful format. It's a discussion among two friends about this very topic. So hopefully you can have a chance to read that and see Eve in another venue for a book talk. Professor Marquis is at the Judge Business School, University of Cambridge. He's the author of a number of books. If you haven't read this one, you might want to pair it with his others. Better Business and Mao and Markets. Prior to joining Cambridge, he was at HBS and the Kennedy School. Welcome. So the Profiteers, when I picked this up, I thought, goodness, the business case for sustainability is clear. And you systematically take me and any reader who's interested through. This book talks about the core of the issues. This talks about the challenges that we're facing. The core of this problem is that we're not quite getting it right. I'm going to ask you to just set the table and the conversation.
Sure. Well, first, thanks so much for having me. This is an amazing event, and it's wonderful that you're having this. So it's really great to be here. So the Profiteers, the subtitle is How Business Privatizes Profit and Socializes Cost, which I think really captures the message of the book. It sounds a little, about the actual economics term, externalities, is a little wonky sounding, but basically, it's the idea that many of the sort of effects of companies on society and the environment are not borne by them, but they're borne by all of us. And this results in companies having higher profits and us all having health issues, climate change, and ways to think about reorienting the society and business so that actually those costs can be captured. And there's a lot of discussion of things like, carbon taxes is one famous one. But I think that where I really focus a lot in the book is actually addressing externalities is a real opportunity for innovation and leadership among companies. And many of the companies that I profile in the book are doing just that.
I want to dig into this a bit more. Externalities. You cite a Rebecca Henderson study. We've all been reading about PFAS, those forever chemicals. Yeah. Can you give some concrete examples of externalities that you want us thinking about?
Sure. So you mentioned that Rebecca Henderson. So she, in her book, I think it's Reimagining Capitalism, While the World's on Fire, has this great example, which I actually use in the book, and it's some power industries in the U.S. They spend about $8 on coal to sort of power, and I guess some of the facilities as well. But actually, it turns out that if you look at the health impacts in the local neighborhood and also the climate change impacts, there's actually $16 of sort of calculated economic cost from burning this coal. So the company's only paying $8, but actually, we as society are bearing that.
We're paying the rest.
We're paying the rest. And so, and who wins in that? I mean, we lose, and actually the company ends up winning. So that is a really good, I think, tangible example of an externality. And frequently, carbon emissions in that example are what actually get sort of the canonical example. But one of the reasons I wrote the book is that this exists in many different, many different spheres, not just in the environment with carbon, but also a lot of, waste.
Netflix. You talk about Netflix.
Yes. Yeah, and this is, so Netflix, there's actually, I think with the power demands of AI, there's been a lot more discussion of how actually, us doing things virtually creates a lot of environmental problems, a lot of carbon emissions, a lot of water, and Netflix is an example. I must admit I've forgotten the exact little anecdote on the cost, but it's really a tremendous amount of carbon emissions, even if companies are operating their various server farms with solar power, because of the materials that get involved in actually building the servers and other reasons. It still has tremendous carbon emissions.
There's a lot behind this.
Yeah.
So what I liked about the Profiteers is you tell the reader there's a bigger story. Corporations are telling us this story, Chris, all the time. We see these wonderful commercials. We're all about sustainability. We have this great program. Talk a little bit about some of what you're seeing. I want to talk about the corporations, then I want to talk about us.
Sure.
But corporations are telling us, I'm working on it.
Yeah, and I think that I think a lot of companies are doing a lot of great things, a lot of great stuff in the environment. So I don't mean to throw everyone in this bucket that I'm about to construct, but actually a lot of what we're hearing from companies is simply greenwashing. This idea of sort of a win-win or doing well by doing good, I think exist really in many ways to actually obscure these externalities and actually avoid policy and other more systemic changes. So one example I give in the book, which people might know about, is this Business Roundtable. This organization of the 200 largest and most powerful companies in the U.S. And they came out with a statement in 2019, reorienting what their avowed purpose of the corporation is. And they said it's actually about delivering value to stakeholders, employees, communities, et cetera, which sounds great, really important. They actually couch it in a language of, this is about our long-term sustainability, and we're still oriented towards profit, but actually we are going to do it through, delivering value to these other stakeholders. Well, it turns out, when you actually say something publicly and get a lot of attention, people check whether you're actually doing it or not. And it turns out there's now been a number of studies, both by journalists, The Guardian, and I think maybe Business Week actually did very in-depth analyses, and also a number of academic studies. It turns out, believe it or not, the Business Roundtable companies, these companies that signed on to this statement that say, we're all about stakeholders, do worse than companies that actually didn't sign on to that. And this is really interesting if you think about it. I could imagine maybe it doesn't have an effect, but they do worse. And one of the studies, I think, whether this is actually the reason or not, we still needs more investigation, but it sort of makes sense to me, described it as a process of moral licensing. So this idea of moral licensing is usually referred to as individuals. It's, to give an example, I'm someone who exercises and does yoga and goes running. And so if I were to do that in the morning, I feel like I'm sort of licensed to have a donut after lunch. So you sort of do something good, and this allows you to do something bad. So this is how they, maybe this is, the Business Roundtable companies, because they have gotten all this press and attention for signing on to this statement, and sort of feeling good about themselves, actually end up doing worse. And they do worse in so many things. They have more environmental infractions. They have more carbon emissions compared to other companies. They have worse labor outcomes. It's really pretty egregious, these companies. And not only that, they're all kinds of lobbying against environmental behavior. So
I like that part of the book, of course. That first part where you outline the core of the problem is really compelling. But then you turn it on us. Chocolate, clothing, French fries from McCain.
Yeah.
We're all part of the problem, or we ought to be understanding the story that we're telling ourselves. Can you speak to some of that?
Yeah, and I don't think we're the problem. I think that consumers and individuals, I think we can be more informed, but I think a lot of it is that the system, broadly speaking, how it's been constructed and how companies can lobby against regulations, I think is more the core of the problem. And so you mentioned these things like chocolate and fast fashion, because businesses are not really held accountable for what happens deep in their supply chains. The extent to which there are things like slavery still in our current day, child labor, I mean, like hundreds of millions of people. This is not like this is an inconsequential, inconsequential amount. There are really big, human rights abuses that none of us would stand for if we actually knew about it, and actually if companies were held accountable for what happens deep in their supply chains.
I want to move to part of the solution. And you've looked at this. I look at it as a corporate lawyer and as a professor, and that's the corporate governance piece of this. Right. Talk a little bit about, I don't want to give too much away in the book, but talk a little bit about how CEOs who might be reading this, or stockholders, can think about what they can do and the power they have.
Yeah. Well, first of all, any CEOs in the audience, and I really appreciate you reading the book, Larry. It's called The Profiteers: How Business Privatizes Profit and Socializes Costs. And people might think, it's just about bashing.
It's not a
large
screed at all. Yeah, it's really thoughtful.
Yeah, I mean, I do. Thank you. Really think it's important to try to diagnose our problems and issues, to try to think about what are the really appropriate solutions. And so I must admit the publisher really loves and focused on this title. I forget what the earlier title was, but I know that at least once had a sort of another part here that said and what we can do about it. But it's a little bit more provocative, I guess, to really focus on the critique. And certainly I believe in that critique, and that's a big part of the book. But also a lot of it is how can we be thinking about governance, accountability, business innovation to try to overcome some of these issues. And so I think that on one simple level, it's not we need to do more, but actually holding companies accountable and having them report on and govern themselves much more for the public good. And there are a lot of solutions out there to do this. So actually in Europe, there's a variety of new regulations that are coming online that are going to hold companies much more accountable. This is actually, we're going to be hearing a lot more about this in the coming years because US companies are also going to be subject to this, even if they have a little bit of footprint in the EU. Their entire corporate sort of structure will be actually accountable for this. And so those business roundtable companies that lobbied very hard against the SEC actually having accountability for ESG, they're going to end up being stuck with this. So I think accountability mechanisms, governance as well. There's been innovations in corporate governance. Something I just wrote about for Fast Company magazine is how AI companies have been adopting these new corporate governance. One of them is called the Benefit Corporation, where companies' corporate charter and legal form actually is held not just to shareholders but broader sets of stakeholders, and they're adopting this. And I think this is an important innovation to orient companies' governance away from just profit. So I'm not bashing this. I think it's very important. But I think the AI companies' adoption of this is a way to actually avoid broader government scrutiny. They can say, oh, we have this corporate form where we're focused on benefits. You can trust us for our environmental impacts, and you can trust us for all the AI risks. So I think it's a challenge that we have because
Right.
The way the system is set up, it's very much about investors and profit first, and I think that we need to actually sort of wrest control a bit from that short-term orientation.
I like how you covered that in the book. It is about the story that a business tells its owners and its employees. And you rightly point out that the typical paradigm since the 60s and 70s has been shareholder primacy.
Yeah.
The only thing that matters is maximizing value for shareholders. We're now moving, as you point out, to different forms, including benefit corporations, B
Right.
Corps, which are relatively new.
Right.
You talk a bit about benefit corps, the pros, the cons, how they might not be able to overcome this ingrained story that the
Right.
only thing that matters is profits. I don't want to give too much away, but can you talk a little bit about your view of benefit corps, B Corps? We have some corporations that are not public.
Right.
Allbirds, Warby Parker, even
Right.
Patagonia
Sure.
is thinking about this. where they want to say to the world, yeah, we want to maximize profits as well as think about other constituencies.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, a challenge, and sort of I guess the story would be more powerful if I had some sort of silver bullet that I could say, this is what we need to do. And I think that these corporate reforms that you mentioned are a huge part of the story. We need policy is another actually really important element. There's also, work in investment markets. So it's actually a lot of different things. One of the sort of stories I tell towards the end of the book is this great and sort of evocative quote from Dwight Eisenhower. Mm-hmm. He was the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, and actually, as I've learned a little bit about him, he was not like a battlefield general where he was sort of commanding the troops. He was actually the master sort of logician and operations person, which for World War II, you think about the landing at Normandy. I mean, this is hundreds of thousands of people and pieces of equipment and machines, and probably, few other, human sort of organizational achievements have been so complex. And someone said to him, like, how do you actually do these? How did you actually organize this? And he said, whenever I see a problem I can't solve, I always make it bigger. And I think this is sort of very thoughtful because, many times the advice that's given is like, okay, you have a big problem, you break it down into, little pieces, and you do those little pieces. I know that's something I sort of follow, and advice I give my students when they're working on their dissertation or something like that. I definitely do not want them thinking about their dissertation being bigger, because that's like an endless, sort of endless hole. But what his point was, and what he said, is that, if you make things bigger, you can actually see connections that actually can help you solve the underlying root cause that you may not otherwise. And I think, that is a lot of what I'm trying to do in this book, because this shareholder primacy that you mentioned is really, I think, very tied up in how we all view the world. And what we need to do is actually unlock thinking, which I think is actually much more common than one than one knows. And apologies for being a little sort of vague and abstract. I'll use you as an example, if you don't mind, Larry. You think about the idea of shareholder primacy, the company should exist for profit. But all of us in here who are sort of entrepreneurs or sort of working in businesses, probably what motivates us is not like just making the most money in the world. You look at this event, you look at your work in prisons. You have a purpose and a vision and want to actually make a difference. And I think this is something that all of us and companies want to actually do. Sure, of course we need to live and we need to, make money. But I think that we have been so sort of oriented and trained that businesses exist for profit and short-term profit. And I think that that's the system that exists, but I think that is fundamentally not how people work. And so a lot of it is trying to unwrite this sort of culture and write a new one.
And it starts with engaging. Yeah. And that's why I loved this as part of our storytelling. And so I'm going to ask you the question you've been asked probably a million times, audience for the book. CEOs who are listening, venture capital folks who might be listening, angel investors who might be listening. Why should they read this book, Chris?
Yeah, I think a big reason why is that actually if you think about the system problems that exist, it actually provides insight into innovation. And I do think that our world is moving more to actually taking account for its externalities. You see this, hurricanes in Florida, wildfires. I think that, as climate change occurs, there's going to be a lot more migration, a lot more social issues. These are going to be the challenges of, the next 50 years. And I think that there's a lot of innovation that can be done to actually address those. And so one example of a company I talk a little bit about in the book is Grove Collaborative. It's a company that, sells and markets sort of health and beauty and cleaning materials, and a lot of the work, a lot of the products they sell are liquids, so they have to be in some non-porous container. And when I interviewed the CEO, a guy named Stu Landsberg, what he told me is that, our social purpose and our mission is focused on eliminating plastic because that is our biggest externality. And so they've done a variety of things that, one of which is rethink the actual design and product formulation of many of their products. So, growing up here in the U.S. in the 70s, 80s, 90s, shampoo comes in bottles. Some of you, may have shampoo that doesn't come in bottles, but actually you don't need to have actually liquid shampoo. Actually, bar shampoo, which I now use after talking to Stu, works very well. It doesn't have to be packaged in plastic, and they've actually won a number of awards for their products, which has actually really elevated their brand. They came up with new processes within their company, like a P&L that's focused on plastic reduction. So it's actually helped them, organize and operate their company, and also a new badging system for consumers, so consumers can understand this. So this is just one example, but just thinking about their role in the systems problems around externalities and plastic and pollution has actually unlocked a lot of innovation for their company. And this is going to position them, I think, very well for the future.
I like that. When you read this, it is like so many of the books that we've curated this time. It's a book that you put down and you say, that's interesting. You do the little good that you can do. Talk a little bit about companies that, at least as you examined, seem to be headed in the right direction that we might know about.
Sure. So one of the ones that I think is really inspiring, and I somewhat hate to use it because it's overused, but you had mentioned Patagonia as one, and I think also too it really speaks to the, in some ways, cognitive shift that can happen even among one of the most sustainable and social purpose focused businesses. So. When I interviewed some of the folks at Patagonia, what someone told me is that a big change for them happened when they started the business Patagonia Provisions. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but they make sort of food and beer, a variety of food goods. In addition, their main business is apparel. They also make some climbing gear. And they said what we learned is actually, and this was in I think 2012, is that if you do agricultural production right, it actually can make the earth and ecosystems better. So you can actually contribute to this, contribute to the soil, add biodiversity. They said this really was challenging to them because their mission statement at the time had the phrase in it, and do less harm, or do as little harm as possible. And they said, we're a business that is all about the environment, and here in our mission statement, we're admitting that we are doing harm, by saying do less harm. And so this set them on this journey of trying to create a more regenerative type of business. Regenerative agriculture is the term for when you design the agricultural system so that it actually rebuilds soil and ecosystems. And so some of you might be familiar. They now have secondhand marketplaces. They do a lot of repairing of products and a lot of other practices to really help sort of extend the life of their products, make sure that they're actually not contributing waste. They have this, don't buy this jacket Friday thing, which encourages people to really think about their consumption. And they changed their vision statement to we're in business to save our home planet. Also recently changed their ownership structure so that the family that owned it, just a few people, Jan Chouinard is the founder who, somewhat well known, you might have heard of, actually turned the company over to a trust.
Unique trust.
Yeah.
Unique form of corporate ownership.
Right.
Isn't it?
So that actually they can after he passes on, can actually continue operating the company for this social purpose and benefit. So these are examples of something where a company, even really very focused on the environment and society, realizes that there are ways to be innovative and creative and thoughtful about our impact on the world and actually add to the world. So we talked about this idea of externalities, and I only really illustrated it with the negative externality idea, where we're paying for companies' production. Actually, if you think about the idea of regeneration, companies can actually have positive externalities as well. And I think this is something that is frequently not thought of, but actually is possible.
Chris, you taught in the U.S. You teach. You've taught overseas.
Yeah.
Are there examples outside of the U.S. where either structures, companies that you look at and say there's a lot to recommend about that?
Yeah, so one company, there's a lot of companies actually outside the U.S. I would say, I'm from the U.S. and a lot of the, work that I do with businesses are in the U.S. So a lot of the examples are U.S. But as I've been in the UK and spending more time in continental Europe in the last 3 years, I moved to Cambridge in 2022. So many really inspiring examples, even more so, I think, than in the U.S., believe it or not. So one that I think is really also important that people might know of is Tony's Chocolonely. I don't know if you've heard of this company. It's a Dutch chocolate company founded by a journalist. So he actually learned during his sort of career as a journalist, writing that actually this issue of child labor and slavery in the chocolate supply chains. Again, this is like hundreds of millions of people. This is not a small thing. And he actually said, I'm going to found a chocolate company to actually help address this. And now it's actually really a very well-known company. Then they're involved not just in their own work of trying to eradicate, slavery in child labor in supply chains through their own production, but actually have a number of initiatives working collaboratively across other companies to both spread the word and create infrastructures in order to actually make this happen. And one of the messages of the book is that working together is actually so important to actually make these changes happen, because Tony's can do its own work, but if they can actually create systems to scale that, it actually can be much more, much easier for other companies to adopt. And there's a lot of really good examples of companies doing that.
And important innovation can be delicious.
Yes, right.
So,
yeah.
You're talking to lots of students all the time. In addition to telling them read the book, what else do you want to say to young people entering the career, going to law school, going to HBS, going to any business school? We're in that intellectual hub. We've got a lot of students who might be leaning in and listening. You want them to read the book. What else do you want to tell them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that most of all, the decisions you make, where you're going to work, the sort of companies you buy from actually do make a difference. And so I think that, leading, a life where we're making decisions that actually respect our values is hugely important. And a lot of attention has been put on conscious consumers, sustainable consumers, that, sort of these Gen Z, younger folks are going to save the world because of their consumption, is going to be positive. I'm not sure if I fully agree with that, so I don't want to, sort of be lumped in with that argument. But I do think that, where you end up working, who you end up working for, it makes a huge difference in the quality of life and passion that you can have and bring to your work. And so I really think, my students, be very thoughtful in who you end up working for, and make sure that it's a place that really, aligns with your values.
You're seeing a continuing theme, our listeners and our readers. Chris, who are the authors or innovators that you're following, thinking about? What are you reading? What are you watching?
Yeah, good question. The book that I'm reading most recently, and it really aligns with our discussion, is by Joseph Stiglitz. It's called The Road to Freedom, which, a theme is that, there's a lot of discourse in the U.S., which is, I, of course, believe in, about sort of liberty and enacting, being able to be, free to make decisions. And a lot of times, this turns into free to not have regulations, or, during COVID, not wear masks or whatever. But what his point is actually frequently individual freedom actually imposes less freedom on other people. And we need to think more about the collective good. And so one of the reasons I'm reading it, I'm actually fortunate enough to see him speak on Sunday at the New Yorker Festival in New York City. So I want to read the book before seeing him. So that's why it's top of my list.
So you get some work ahead of you, but I can tell you, you can read quickly if it's a good book.
Yeah, definitely.
And this is. So I want to give folks a chance to go outside and meet you, get their book signed. The book is The Profiteers. Professor Christopher Marquis, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Larry.